Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is called Visitors to Earth, 10 Incredible Humanoid Encounters. These are all true first-hand eyewitness accounts coming from all over the planet actually. I've got cases from France, Italy, Spain, and Poland, as well as Australia and Indonesia, Canada, Argentina, and a couple from the United States. These cases date all the way back to 1948 up to 2008, so quite a long period of time there. And a wide variety of ETs, everything from tiny little humanoids to short humanoids, grays, human-looking ETs, robotic beings, a real wide variety of humanoids. And of course, all kinds of evidence to support it. 7 out of 10 of these cases are in fact multiple witness cases. That always strengthens the credibility of a case. But some of these cases also involve physiological evidence or landing traces, animal reactions, electromagnetic disturbances, and one case even has radar returns to support it. So some pretty good cases here. Some really interesting ones as well. I'm pretty sure you haven't heard of most of these, but let's just get started. In the first case I'd like to talk about today, I call the alien in the beam of light. This occurred on April 3rd, 1948 in San Martino, Italy. I like this case because it's a multiple witness case. It occurred very early, long before UFOs were widely publicized. And it's got some really interesting aspects to it in terms of the ET humanoid especially. This case comes from Italian researcher Solas Boncompagni and was published in his book UFOs in Italy. It occurred at 6:35 a.m. on April 3rd, 1948, as taxi bus driver Giuseppe Lanciano was waiting for the 7 o'clock train whose arrival had been delayed. He was waiting at toll booth number 14 in Fara di Signo. This is in the city of San Martino, Italy. Suddenly, a strange glowing orange circular-shaped object appeared overhead. He said it was shaped kind of like an upside-down bowl or, quote, an open umbrella without a handle. It quickly moved overhead at about 60 kilometers per hour and then hovered about 10 meters above a hill, only 500 meters away, so pretty close. And it hovered there for several minutes, glowing with light. It was long enough for him to estimate the diameter of the object, which he believed was about 10 to 15 meters in diameter. He said it also had a little, quote, cup, sort of shaped protrusion on top, which looked transparent as it was glowing with a silvery light. So it looked to Giuseppe like this object was about to land on the hill, and seeing how unusual it was, he immediately called it to the attention of the station master, a Mr. Bavota, who was talking on the phone nearby. And they both watched this object for some time when suddenly a beam of very bright white light came out of the bottom center of the object. And they were close enough to it that they could actually feel heat coming from this beam of light. Then, in this beam of light was a humanoid form, but definitely not a normal human. They estimate it was about 1.5 meters tall, 4.5, 5 feet. Its posture was strangely rigid. Its arms were outstretched. It looked to them like it was wearing a metallic reflective suit of some kind with thick gloves. And instead of a face, all they could see were 2 circles, 2 big round circles where the eyes were. It kind of reminded the witnesses of a puppet. They said it floated very slowly, very evenly to the ground. And at this point, Giuseppe became quite curious. He had no fear, so he decided he was going to run up to it, which he did. And as soon as he started running towards this being, this robotic-type creature, started to float back up into the craft. It entered inside of it, the beam retracted, the craft oscillated back and forth for a few moments and then zoomed silently and upwards at an incredibly high speed. So it's certainly a pretty brief case, but quite compelling. A brief case, certainly, but definitely compelling with the multiple witnesses. And again, because it occurred quite early in the history of, the modern age of UFOs. And I also found it interesting the way these witnesses described the humanoid that they saw. There's just some interesting elements to that case of a visitation in a pretty small town. And now we move to another case, which is even more interesting, I think. I call this one Wendy and the Aliens. This occurred in June of 1949 in Dunino, Poland. We don't hear a lot about cases from Poland, so I think that alone makes this interesting. But this is another multiple witness account. It has landing traces as well. And what I find most interesting about this is that they had never heard of UFOs and didn't even consider the possibility that they were seeing possibly extraterrestrials until many years later. This very interesting case comes from Polish researcher Damian Trela, and it's featured in his book Secrets of Lower Silesia. This is written in Polish. But it was a warm morning around 5 a.m. in June of 1949 as the main witness, Wanda M., she's 7 years old, heard her uncle Mikhail and her neighbor Bartholomew run into the house terrified and shouting that, quote, something had landed in Bartholomew's field. So Wanda's father woke up and all three men, still dressed in their pajamas, ran out of the house and into the field to take a closer look. Meanwhile, Wanda's mother also woke up, along of course with Wanda, and Wanda followed the three men into the field. Her mother was too afraid. She stood outside of the house, afraid to get any closer. So Wanda joined her father and the other two men, and immediately they all saw a bright yellow light coming from the bottom of a very large object which had landed in their field. In fact, they all walked up to no more than 10 feet away from this object, which they said was sort of silver brown in color, was cone-shaped, and it was emitting a slight whooshing noise. It had what appeared to be 2 rows of rectangular windows going up the side of the cone, and these windows were emitting a silver-tinged yellow light. The thinnest part of the cone was at the top, and the thickest was at the base. A band encircled the base of the object, which was about 6 feet high, and they could see an indentation visible at the base from which small steps led to the ground. This object was landing on 3 sort of landing legs, which came from the lower section and out to the ground at an angle. It was about, this object, maybe 4 to 5 feet wide at the base, and about twice the height of a normal person. So not huge, but certainly not that small either. Beneath the cone, they could see a blue-yellow light shining out at an angle, and it was strange because while it was shining out, it wasn't actually touching the ground. But most amazing, however, were these 2 figures standing there. They were wearing coveralls, and when the witnesses approached, the figures appeared to sort of unfasten the coveralls in the neck area and lift a hood, which revealed a sort of transparent faceplate. There also appeared to be a darker covering underneath the outer suit, and it looked like it had a stripe down the center front from chin to navel. These figures were about 6 feet tall, and they looked human in appearance, very well built, with large feet. They had 5 fingers on each hand, so pretty much human looking. Now these figures began to speak in a foreign, unrecognizable language to the witnesses. So it was neither Polish, it wasn't Russian or German, because they spoke those languages, but they did not recognize this language. It did seem to the witnesses that these figures were asking a question or trying to show them something. So the men asked these guys if they wanted something to eat or drink, but there was no response. The figures did continue to make gestures for a period of about 10 minutes, which is a pretty long time. At some point they did sort of point towards the nearby towns of Kozice and Legnica, but apparently unable to make themselves understood, They put their hands on their chest, bowed slightly, and then turned towards the object. Now at this point, the area where the indentation was at the base of this object, this opened up to reveal a door. And this is when the witnesses saw a third figure inside the object. The two figures bowed again, signaled the witnesses to step back, and then climbed the steps into this cone-shaped object. They noticed that the door was small enough that the figures actually had to hunch down to enter inside of it. So they went inside, the steps retracted and the opening closed, and then the object began to make a noise similar to, quote, a heavy downpour. At this point, a brilliant light came out of the base of the object, which rose vertically just a short distance and then flew away in a gentle curve towards the town of Legnica. So after talking about this incident, they returned to the house where they did find Wanda's mother waiting and nervously weeping because she thought that this incident heralded another invasion of their country. And in fact, all the witnesses at this point assumed that the figures that they had seen were normal humans from some foreign country on a reconnaissance mission of some kind. And it would be years later, when Wanda, the 7-year-old, heard about UFOs, that she changed her mind about this and decided it was more likely that these visitors may have been extraterrestrial in origin. But there was one other thing that's quite interesting. After this craft departed, they found an area of yellowed and crushed vegetation about 2 to 3 meters in diameter where this craft had stood. And it remained there for 2 to 3 years. In fact, when grain was planted in the field, it failed to grow where the craft had stood. I like the cases with landing traces. There's often skeptics saying there's no physical evidence supporting this subject. And the truth is there is quite a lot of it. It's certainly not easy to fake. And it's one of the more compelling types of evidence out there. But when you have multiple witnesses who are that close to a landed UFO and humanoids, it's undeniable that something really profound is happening here. And there's always another case to take its place. And if even one of these were true, that would be amazing. But the fact is there's thousands upon thousands upon thousands. And here's another one, which I call almost abducted. This took place on February 5, 1967 in Hilliard, Ohio, which is a pretty small town, especially back then. This is a single witness case, though it does have some pretty interesting evidence to it, and was also investigated by experienced researchers from the National Investigative Committee of Aerial Phenomenon. This case comes from researcher Stephen Mackey, who was associated with NICAP, and he conducted a telephone interview with the witness and also published the case in the NICAP publication UFO Investigator. He called it one of the most incredible cases that they had received during this time. It was the evening of February 5, 1967, when the witness, 15-year-old Timothy J., was outside his home in Hilliard, Ohio, and he heard a strange noise. At the same time, his dog started barking. Looking up, he saw an egg-shaped craft about 75 feet long, 45 feet high, coming in at low altitude over the shoulder of a nearby road. And as he watched, this craft landed in a field not too far away, coming to a rest on 3 landing legs. So after this craft landed, he moved closer to it and watched, and saw this elevator-like shaft appear and several human-looking figures come out of it. Each of them were carrying small spheres, which they began to place on the ground around the ship near the sides of this craft. The witness did notice something else. Timothy said that each of these beings walked with, quote, a slight limp. He did not describe how they were dressed. But after doing this, these figures appeared to just stand around the craft as if waiting for something. And it was shortly later a man appeared walking across the field up to these figures, and it looked to Timothy like they were holding a telepathic conversation. In fact, Timothy said that they had a, quote, hypnotic look about them. So it was at this point that Timothy accidentally stepped on a twig, which made a loud snapping noise, and this immediately caught the attention of the figures standing around the craft, and all of them turned to look at him. Now this, naturally, frightened Timothy quite badly, and he tried to run away. But one of the figures, who Timothy sensed was the leader, actually ran after him and caught him by the back of the neck, stopping Timothy in his tracks. Immediately a second figure joined him, and the two of them dragged the frightened Timothy up to their craft. They had almost reached the door and appeared to about pull him inside when, says Timothy, the humanoids looked at each other with what he perceived to be a panic-stricken look. They immediately dropped him. They quickly gathered up the spheres that they had placed around the craft and retreated with them back into the UFO, which promptly took off. Timothy noticed at this point that the back of his neck had a little burn mark where he had been grabbed, and he reported this incident to authorities. And he says that he was actually visited by an unnamed Air Force officer who investigated the incident and confirmed the burn mark on his neck. Timothy then wrote a letter to NICAP, and he was put in touch with the investigator, Stephen Mackey. What an unusual case that is. You don't hear a lot of cases quite like that. I also find it interesting that the witness says he was interviewed by Air Force officials. Unfortunately, the investigators were not able to confirm that, and there is no real follow-up on this case. But certainly a compelling case of a UFO landing and humanoids. And now we move to another really interesting case that got a lot of attention, actually. Because the witness is quite credible, I call this one a UFO in the backyard. It is actually a multiple witness case which occurred on July 20, 1967 in Titusville, Florida. One of the most interesting things about this case is the location, which is not far actually from Kennedy Space Center, so that could be a factor here. This case was also investigated by NICAP, the National Investigative Committee for Aerial Phenomena, more specifically by Clark McClelland. The primary witness is Elizabeth L. Douglas, who at the time of the incident was 49 years old. It was around 8:15 p.m. on July 20, 1967, and she had stepped out of her home in Titusville, Florida, to get something out of her car, which was parked out in front of her house. Recently, a neighborhood boy had mowed her lawn and had scattered part of the fence all over the lawn, and unfortunately Elizabeth tripped over it and fell down. And as she reached out to grab a nearby branch and pull herself up to a standing position, she looked to the north and was amazed to see a large bell-shaped craft approaching from the north. She said it was only about 200 feet away and quite large, 60 to 70 feet high in the sky, totally silent. She estimated it was about 50 to 60 feet long, and it had 5 squarish portholes visible around the edge of this craft. And it moved slowly towards her and looked, she said, quote, bigger than the house across the street. And in fact, it moved over the street opposite her house, and this is when she noticed something that quite frightened her. She could see a humanoid form inside through the windows, actually more than one. As she says, there were other forms moving about, but I did not notice this as much as the form close to the window. I could not tell if this form was trying to look out of the window or if he was doing something else. But I did notice that he looked very lean, and the arms were very long. The humanoid form appeared to be leaning forward with one or both hands pressing against the transparent glass-like window. She said that this being appeared to be looking out of the window to scan the terrain. She wasn't sure, but this thoroughly frightened her because this being did not appear to be human. As Elizabeth says in her own words, the creature had rubbery arms that seemed to be longer than those normally observed on mature men or women. The torso was slim and showed no midsection or chest structure. The head of the entity was egg-shaped, and no facial features such as eyes, nose, mouth, or ears were visually evident. So looking at the other portholes briefly, she saw that they glowed unevenly, with some being much brighter than others. Some were bright enough to illuminate the outside of the craft, which she said appeared to be sort of a dull, finished metal. One window was almost completely dark, but through the illuminated windows she could see, quote, shadowy movements indicating that other life forms were engaged in motion somewhere inside the strange craft. So she called out for her daughter, and as Elizabeth's daughter Ingrid, age 20, came outside, Elizabeth also called out to her other son, Stephen. He's 15 years old, but he was watching TV inside and didn't respond. As Ingrid joined her mother and looked up, she also saw the UFO and, very startled, shouted out, "What is that?" At this point, her mother Elizabeth was too frightened to even respond. And by this point, she had already been watching this UFO and this entity for a full 2 minutes. And for the next 5 minutes, both she and Ingrid watched this craft. At this point, Elizabeth now ran inside to call the Titusville Police Department. And she informed them that this craft was still outside, told them its current location, its speed, and the direction it was moving. They told her that they would send an officer to investigate. Meanwhile, her son Stephen was still watching TV, but he noticed something pretty unusual and perhaps important. These weird horizontal lines started passing through the screen of the picture tube. At this point, the UFO moved off and was gone. So, Elizabeth and Ingrid were put in touch with NICAP researcher Clark McClelland, who along with other researchers questioned both the witnesses extensively, and they came away absolutely convinced that they had seen a genuine UFO and its occupant or occupants. As Clark McClelland says, and I quote, "It is the opinion of this investigative unit that due to the sincerity of each witness, this incident should be considered factual as far as personal observation and understanding of the unidentified object are concerned by those involved. There has been no concrete evidence found to prove this case to be a perpetrated hoax." So researcher Gordon Lohr called it, quote, "one of the most interesting and compelling cases," which had been received during this very active 1967 wave. And Gordon added that this case, quote, "added to our growing collection of reliable witnesses who are having encounters with humanoid-like flying saucer occupants." And again, it's quite interesting that the location of this sighting is only about 25 miles away from the Kennedy Space Center. The investigators were clearly impressed with this case. The witnesses are quite credible, has electromagnetic evidence as well, with the TV becoming full of static. To me, perhaps the most interesting thing is its proximity to Kennedy Space Center, which certainly could be a factor, because there are a number of cases on record where ETs do seem to show an interest in our technology and rocket launches and things like this. Who knows, it's speculation, but it could very well be. And now we move to our next case, which I call I Know What I Saw. This occurred in the summer of 1972 in Molong, Australia. It is technically a single witness case, and it wasn't professionally investigated, but it's a daylight case of a landing and humanoids seen very close up, and it's a really interesting eyewitness testimony as well. The witness in this case is anonymous, but I'll call her Patricia, and she reported her experience to both MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, and NUFORC, the National UFO Reporting Center. It took her many years to do so. She kept quiet about it for quite some time. She says the date of the incident is approximate, but it was one morning around 7:30 a.m. in either August or September of 1972. At the time, Patricia was a 13-year-old student, and she was being driven by her mother to school, along with two other passengers who were going to work. They were driving from Molong to the city of Orange. This is, again, in Australia. And they were about 5 kilometers east of Molong when Patricia, who was sitting in the back seat, noticed a very bright glow in the distance on top of a small hill not far from the road. Now, she assumed that this was the reflection of the morning sun on a new tin roof. She lost sight of it briefly as the road curved, but as they approached closer, she saw it again, and she saw that it was not a new tin roof. It was something quite different and very strange. As Patricia says in her own words, I noticed a very large object, about the size of a large shipping container in length and about twice as wide, and 1.5 containers tall. On either side, humanoid beings were standing, holding something. In the middle, one humanoid was walking towards the fence line. The road was about 20 feet beyond the fence. As I looked at the humanoid, he appeared to look back at me while he was walking to the fence line. So these were definitely not normal humans. According to Patricia, these beings looked quite tall, at least 6 feet. She thinks they were probably closer to 7 feet tall. One was holding a sort of tablet or book-like object. It appeared to be watching the traffic, and it looked to her like it was almost taking notes or something. The object itself was glowing with a very bright fluorescent-like aura. This object was oval or saucer-shaped, had a very smooth surface, a dome on top, and it sat on landing legs, only 3 of which were visible to the witness, but she suspects there were 4. It was parked right between 2 dead trees. She said a ramp extended from the center of this object to the ground. And yeah, these figures were not normal. As Patricia said, the humanoids were wearing what looked like a metallic, dull, silvery colored suit, similar to a wetsuit, from head to toe, tight-fitting. The headwear looked like a full face mask, but with no protrusions, like it was fitting over the head and face in one piece. The suits themselves glowed like the craft, or reflecting the sun intensely. The faceplates or visors appeared to be dark or black, but Patricia was very much intrigued and puzzled by what she was seeing, especially this figure who was closest to her and was walking at a slow pace towards the fence line and the road. The other figures were just standing around the craft. She had the impression they were there to keep guard. Now Patricia was so stunned by this, she wanted to call out to her mother and the other passengers, but as she says, for some reason I didn't. It was like a feeling that I shouldn't say anything because it felt wrong. It looked like they were collecting things and looking at the cars going past. I am sure the one walking down to the road saw me as he turned his helmet and followed our car with his black-looking visor. Now there was other traffic on the road, but nobody else seemed to be reacting to this strange sight. But as Patricia says, I still remember it like it was yesterday. I know what I saw, and to this day I can show you exactly where they were. I see it now as if it was only yesterday. Unfortunately, that case wasn't professionally investigated, but certainly is compelling, and I think when someone sees something that close up, the chances of misidentification are pretty much zero. As she says, I know what I saw, and this is certainly a quote a lot of witnesses say. It must be quite an experience to see something that close up and know that this is really unusual. All right, now let's move to our next case, a really interesting case. This one I call the Alien and the Snowmobiler. This is a multiple witness case. It occurred on February 26, 1973 in McWaters. This is in Quebec, Canada, and it's a really compelling case. Again, multiple witnesses and landing trace evidence. This very unusual case comes from Canadian researcher Jean Ferguson and was published in his popular book written in French, Les Humanoids, or the Humanoids. The main witness is known only as Helene R. She's 14 years old, and she was out enjoying a day of snowmobiling with her 2 brothers and 7 teenage friends in the McWaters area of Quebec, Canada. They had been out all day, and it was now around 8 p.m. This is again February 26, 1973, and everyone was riding around on their own individual snowmobiles when all of them suddenly saw a giant, quote, light rise up from behind them and pass directly over the group. It was so bright it illuminated the whole landscape around them, and then it moved on. Once it was gone, the boys didn't think too much about it and decided to race each other. And 14-year-old Helene was left behind. And this is when suddenly this strange glowing object reappeared, flew back over her and behind her. Helene estimates it was quite large, about 60 feet in diameter. Suddenly the illumination from this object went out, and Helene wondered if perhaps it was a plane that had crashed somewhere behind her. So she decided to turn around and go investigate. She went back about 500 feet, got off her snowmobile, and started walking towards this large, dark, bulky object, which she could just make out among the trees. And she had approached to about within 50 feet of it, when, without warning, a hand reached out from behind her, grabbed her, and tried to drag her backwards. At this point, Helene assumed it was her younger brother playing a joke. So she broke free from whoever had grabbed her and pushed them down into the snow. And turning around to face them, boy, she got a shock, because she saw what she first assumed was a small child, smaller than her 13-year-old brother. It was sitting in the snow, and she could see, no, this was not a child. She quickly ran back to her snowmobile just a short distance away and grabbed a flashlight and shone it on the figure to get a better look. This figure at this point had risen up and was now walking slowly towards her. And sure enough, it wasn't another child. It was a humanoid figure just under 4 feet tall, wearing dark, tight-fitting clothing with a strange, quote, plated surface. It also wore a helmet that covered his head down to the chin. This helmet had a visor which reflected the light, but she could see this being's face and was surprised to see that it had enormous eyes that seemed to shine brightly in the light like a cat's does. This figure did seem to have some difficulty walking in the snow, she noticed, but this scared her badly. She dropped her flashlight, ran to her snowmobile, hopped on it, and fled the area. She immediately found her family and friends, and together they went home, because as it turned out, Helene had a weird symptom. Her left arm appeared to be paralyzed. She couldn't move it. She was taken to a doctor who gave her a sedative, and as far as I can tell, this was a temporary thing. But the next day, several people went back to the place where Helene had seen this humanoid, and in fact they found a large patch of snow which was melted down to the ground. It was donut-shaped and about 50 feet wide, which matches what Helene saw in terms of this object. And next to it were 2 sets of very small bipedal tracks. They were short but quite broad, with a large protruding big toe. When you have that many witnesses, when you have landing trace evidence and apparent footprints, it's really hard to explain this away as something mundane. It's a really compelling case, and there are so many like it. It's really interesting to me that this ET actually reached out and touched the witness. That's pretty unusual, though that happened in the previous case in Hilliard, Ohio. So this does happen. And here's another really interesting case, which I call the giant humanoid. Another multiple witness case, which occurred on July 1st, 1979 in Sangonera la Verde. This is in Spain, actually. And it's quite a compelling case with 4 witnesses, actually more, who saw the UFO itself, but a very close-up encounter with a very strange humanoid. This next case was published by Iker Jimenez in his book, and also by Francisco J. Sarabia in the magazine Stendek, and by Albert Rosales, who published the case in his book. There are 4 witnesses: Antonio Guirao Carrillo, age 16, his cousin Jose Carrillo, age 14, and their 2 friends, Ginés Jimenez Arrau and Jesus, both age 17. It was about a half an hour after midnight, and they decided to go out on their motorbikes along the dirt roads of Sangonera la Verde. This is in Murcia, Spain, and they were looking for turtle dove nests. This is out in the mountains. It's quite rural there. And coming around a curve in this dirt path or road, this is when they noticed a very bright light, which appeared to be hovering over a well-known landmark. the Cabezo de la Caracola, it's called. So they wondered briefly if this might be hunters with flashlights, but the problem was this light was far too bright for flashlights. So they kept their eyes on it as this light appeared to move around in circles, sometimes changing colors from white to yellow, and at one point apparently red. They came around another curve and they approached close enough that the headlights of their motorbikes were shining on the hill where this light was. And when this happened, the strange light seemed to respond with bright flashes that illuminated the entire environment around them in a bright yellow light. So they arrived at an old abandoned house and they decided to stop and sit under a pine tree, smoke a few cigarettes, and wait for this strange light to go away. But it didn't. Instead, it stayed still. And after almost an hour of watching this, the events escalated when they heard the sound of branches being stepped on, footsteps coming towards them. And looking towards this noise, which was growing louder and closer, they suddenly saw a very tall being. They estimate 7.5 feet tall, and it was walking down the middle of the dirt road and coming directly towards them. Very quickly, it was about 15 to 20 feet away, but it stopped abruptly when the boys jumped up and looked at it. And yeah, this being was strange in several ways. It was moving in short, slow steps, and it did not move its arms when it walked. It was wearing a shiny, tight-fitting white jacket with what looked like pockets on the chest, with wavy stripes on these apparent pockets. It had a stripe going down the center of its suit. It also wore a squarish helmet with a dark faceplate. At this point, the boys noticed an unnatural and absolute silence over the area. No insect noises, no crickets, nothing. They were very frightened by the appearance of this figure, so two of the boys immediately jumped on their motorcycles and began to leave. Two of the other boys, they stayed a moment longer, but when the first two boys left and this tall figure continued to approach them, they also jumped on their motorbikes and all four fled the area as fast as they could. And in fact, one of them did get a flat and broken spokes on his wheels, but didn't stop, not until they reached the town. They got back into town and rushed into a little restaurant bar on El Palmeral Street, and they shared their story with the people there. And in fact, they convinced some of the people in that restaurant to go outside and look. And going outside, all four boys and some other witnesses did see a white light rising from this hill. It reached a certain height, then made a sudden 90-degree turn to the south. At this point, some of the people decided to take a car up to the mountain to investigate, and arriving there, they found that the dogs of a shepherd who worked in this area were very excited, barking crazily. And as soon as the car arrived, these dogs hid under the cars and refused to come out. This really puzzled the owner of the dogs. He says his dogs were normally quite brave, afraid of nothing. And it was some days after the encounter that reporters went up to the area, having heard about this incident, and they found what appeared to be the footprints of the humanoid, which were in fact photographed. Also, 3 triangular indentations were found in the soil, and they were indented quite deeply into the soil, which indicated that there was an object of great weight had come down on the ground there. There you go. Multiple witnesses, animal reactions, landing traces with photographs of the landing traces. That's pretty unusual. So a really important case, I think. I don't think the general public has any idea how common these kinds of events are. There are so many of them. They've been occurring for such a long time. In my opinion, skeptics simply don't have a leg to stand on at this point. Because if you examine the evidence, it's undeniable that we are being visited. And here is another case, which I call, I am certain that I saw an extraterrestrial craft, which is of course a direct quote from one of the witnesses. This is actually a series of events, which is quite complicated, occurring throughout January, most specifically on January 4, 1994, in various locations in France, including Évreux, Bacqueville, and Meuse. So it was over a fairly wide location. But some incredible evidence, a lot of witnesses in this case, and so interesting. This case is so interesting because, yes, it involves a series of encounters that occurred throughout France on one night, which may or may not be directly connected, but the first encounter comes from the Noel family, which is comprised of Loic, the father, Rosaline, the mother, and their 18-year-old daughter, Swazik, who they were driving to her dojo. It was around 6:30 p.m. on January 4, 1994, and they were driving along the D74 highway in Évreux, France. And they were only about 400 meters, less than a quarter mile, from the D55 interchange or intersection. And this is when Swazik looked out through the window to the right and noticed a very large, dark, kind of triangular-shaped craft up ahead. She said it had 3 red lights at each apex. She immediately alerted her parents, and all 3 saw it as it approached more closely, then crossed the road in front of them. It did disappear from view for a brief moment. Then they saw it again, 200 meters or 650 feet to the left of their car. And as they turned onto the D55, it began to parallel the road for a short distance, kind of pacing their car, but moving slightly faster than their car and ahead of them. They estimate that it was about 30 meters wide, close to 100 feet, though after speaking with investigators, they sort of upgraded this or re-evaluated its size as nearly twice this. As Loic says in his own words, "I immediately thought that if it was a plane, it would crash, but it wasn't a plane. It was flying much too low, much too fast, and above all, silently. Besides, we are used to seeing planes and we know how to tell the difference." Swazik says, "I have always thought that we could not be alone in the universe. Witnessing this phenomena confirmed this idea. It was a wonderful moment." So this sighting really impacted them, and in fact, following the sighting, Swazik began to dream constantly of UFOs. She had one repetitive dream where she would see the UFOs and take photographs of it, but she had all kinds of dreams about this. She said in another one of her dreams, this UFO would land in her front yard and several small-sized, alien-looking figures would come out and invite her on board. In the dream, she always becomes afraid of them, saying that they look, quote, mean and strange, and she tries to attack them. And then she would find herself in this strange red desert. After one of these dreams, she woke up and she was shocked to see that her flashlight in her bedroom had apparently turned on by itself. So somewhat unusual. But meanwhile, only about 5 hours after the Noel family's encounter, at 10 minutes before midnight, there was another encounter. The main witness is Didier Maury. He's a chef, and he was watching TV in his home in Bacqueville. And this is when he noticed a strong yellow-orange illumination about 300 meters, less than 1,000 feet, from his home. And the second he looked at it, he saw this brilliant light transform into what he perceived to be a conical shape, with the point facing upwards. And it was glowing brightly with different colors, including red, blue, and green. He said it looked very pretty, and immediately it started spinning at high speed, and then it disappeared or appeared to shrink down to a small glow, and it now moved to the northwest in the direction of the nearby Chateau Bonnemar. But very quickly, this sort of glowing cone-shaped object reappeared, and now it was noticeably approaching him. At this point, Didier became quite fearful and panicky. He quickly shut off the television to plunge the room into darkness so as not to draw attention to himself. And then he ran to his bedroom and crawled into bed, not bothering to wake up his wife. At the same time, his little dog, who had been outside, came running inside and actually crawled under the bed in fear. And soon this very strange event became even stranger, because as Didier says, "I didn't want to wake my wife. I was as if paralyzed by the event. At the foot of my gable, on the street side, I heard a crunching on the ground." So this sounded to him like footsteps, and then things went from very strange to truly bizarre, because as Didier says, it was at that moment that I felt strange sensations deep down in my back, as well as in my lower limbs. I had a flash in my eyes with an astonishing feeling to be in some way auscultated. Now this means this is what happens when a doctor is examining the sounds of your heart. So he had some weird feeling that he was being physically examined. And then, as he says, then suddenly, nothing more, except a real scare, with the feeling of having experienced something completely quite extraordinary. So needless to say, he was absolutely astonished, and he believed he had just had a brush with a UFO. As he says, "It's true, I was very scared, and I hope I don't have to live such an experience again. It's hard to imagine the impression that it leaves. I believed in it, but nothing more. Yet that night, I am certain that I saw an extraterrestrial craft." So having heard these footsteps, he suspected that there were probably ETs outside his house, but the events weren't over yet. Soon more events followed, because later on January 17, both he and his wife heard a loud noise in the field behind their house, but both were too scared to look outside. And 3 days later, on January 20th, he saw another strange, unidentified light in the sky. Investigators, of course, did research all of these incidents, and they found another witness who was at nearby Bonmar, just a few kilometers away, who on January 4th, the night of Didier's original sighting and that of the Noel family, said he saw a, quote, strange luminous craft which in no case could have been an airplane. Now, Didier did not report his sighting at first. It would have remained unknown if not for what happened to another family on, again, the same night, some distance away, in the small town of Tronville-en-Berrois, again in France. This includes the Lopez family. The father's name is Michel. Also included his wife, Michelle, and their 3 daughters, Severine, age 17, Delphine, age 13, and Priscilla, age 7. Also in the house was David, age 20, who was Severine's boyfriend. All of them lived along a little street called Rue des Coquelicots. And you can see their house here. This is the exact location. And they were getting ready for bed when Michel was awakened by a bright light shining on the road between 2 fields near their house. This was only about 300 feet away. And as the father Michel says, the strange light invaded the room. We were literally blinded, but the light did not hurt our eyes. So as Michel, his wife, and daughter, Priscilla, rushed to the window, the light dimmed in brilliance, at which point they could see that it was actually a craft of some kind with multiple red flashing lights, 2 yellow lights. They could see numerous beams of white light shining upward at an angle. They said the craft was saucer-shaped, very much like a bowl. It had a transparent dome on top. It appeared to be about 5 meters in diameter and 2.5 meters high. And inside this transparent dome, they could see 3 humanoid shapes. The one in the middle appeared to have a larger head than the others. The one on the right was shorter and appeared to be heavier set than the other 2. But all 3 appeared to be wearing shiny, whitish-gray, metallic-looking outfits. So shocked, they all went outside. Michel actually alerted 2 of his neighbors to this incident. Everyone came outside to look at it. And the members of the Lopez family in a unit stepped cautiously forward to get a closer look. And they approached to about 80 meters of this object, about 250 feet. And as the wife says, it was a strange engine, very bright, circular in shape, which emitted a strange whistle. So as they watched, a door on the left side of the object opened. This made a slight noise. One of the figures came down, and according to the witnesses, he looked like a normal human. He was carrying a squarish flashlight, which he shone towards the witnesses, moving it from side to side as if to examine them. He then immediately walked back into the object. The door closed, making another weird noise. The transparent dome became even darker, and this object took off with a slight hissing sound and moved off behind a row of houses and was lost from view. The whole encounter lasted, they estimate, about 7 minutes. The next morning, the Lopezes were visited by a family friend who lived just a few kilometers away, and she immediately told them that she had seen this weird light illuminating her room the night before. This was at the same time of the Lopezes' encounter. The Lopezes then explained what happened to them, and it was then that they decided to call the newspapers. And this led to the case being officially investigated, both by police and UFO researchers. Now, going to the place where the craft had been, they found 3 circles and about 20 centimeters wide where the soil had been depressed into the ground. So this could be a genuine ET encounter. It's possible this is also a reverse engineered craft with humans. Hard to say for sure, but certainly an interesting series of events, all on one night. And it turned out the activity was going on throughout January, because later on January 9th, another witness in the area said he saw a luminous sphere in the sky. January was a busy month for France in this area. This is again 1994, and a really famous case occurred just a few weeks later. Air France Flight 3532, being piloted by Captain Jean-Charles Dubac, was flying over the Coulommiers region of Seine-et-Marne, France, when the entire crew noticed this brownish red, sort of disc-shaped object. It was in view for only a few moments before disappearing. It looked to them like it was changing shape, but this could be a matter of perspective. But what's really interesting is this was confirmed on radar by the Cinq-Mars-la-Pile radar station, where it was tracked for 50 seconds, which corresponded both in time and flight path to the observation made by the crew of Flight 3532. So there you go, 4 or 5 incidents over a very short period of time in a pretty sharply defined area. Hard to say for sure whether they're all connected, but it certainly looks like it. And when you have this much activity going on, you have to wonder why. What's going on in that area at that time to draw in so much UFO activity? It's really interesting. And now we move to another case which I found really bizarre and quite compelling. Don't know that I've ever heard of an ET description quite like this. It's certainly similar to other cases and has a lot of elements that we do see in cases, but it's very unusual. I call this one the ET in the Palm Plantation. It occurred one evening in April 2008 in Bangkinang, Indonesia. I like this case because we don't hear a lot of cases coming from this area. It's also interesting that this was a plantation of palm trees. Perhaps that's why the ET was there, presuming this is an ET, because we do see a lot of cases of UFOs and ETs landing at farms and picking various plants and this sort of thing. So perhaps that was the draw. Hard to say for sure, but you can make up your own mind about it. This next case was posted by Su Prapto on the UFOnesia Indonesia UFO blog. I believe he is the witness. As the witness says in his own words, I'll just let him describe it because it's a very interesting account. As the witness says, I saw a glowing object falling on the Palm Plantation Hill about 300 meters from my house in Bangkinang, Riau. This is again in Indonesia. And as he says, a few moments later, I started the motorbike and immediately drove to where the object fell. But about 50 meters before arriving, I was shocked, half dead, because suddenly there was a creature blocking the way. My motorbike braked suddenly. I set the motorbike lights high while revving the gas to make it brighter. The creature was clearly visible. It was more than 2 meters tall. It looked thin, with a long neck, longer than a normal human, a bald head tapering upwards, with round eyes and pointed ears. The witness elaborated further, saying that this being's arms dangled down below its waist. He says its hands had very long fingers, and it appeared to be naked except for a pair of underwear. He didn't get a good look at the legs because the headlights of his motorbike illuminated this figure only from the waist up. But he was very curious and eager to investigate what he was looking at, so he shifted the clutch on his motorcycle, raced forward to get a closer look. But as he approached, this strange creature quickly jumped to the side and behind a palm tree. When the witness reached the spot where the creature had been, it was gone. And as he says, I was really surprised. What kind of creature is that? Now, he does report having a number of UFO sightings in the past, but this was apparently his only face-to-face encounter with an actual humanoid. That is a single witness case, yes, and it wasn't professionally investigated, but certainly the witness seemed absolutely sincere, clearly puzzled, clearly frightened by what he saw, and it's just an all-around interesting case. And now we move to the last case in this little compilation, which I call The Magnetic Man. And you'll see why I gave it that title. This occurred on May 21st, 2008 in a small town of San Carlos, Argentina. This is a multiple witness case. In fact, there's quite a number of witnesses who saw UFO activity at the time, though only three people had a very close-up encounter with an extremely unusual humanoid. This unique and unusual case was written up by Scott Corrales, also Albert Rosales, and other researchers. In fact, it received considerable news coverage following its occurrence. The main witnesses are Walter Lopez, a mechanic, and Omar Ferlati, who you can see here. They were out in the farm fields near San Carlos. This is located near Salta, Argentina. It was the evening of May 21st, 2008, when suddenly they noticed a short, glowing humanoid, only about 40 centimeters tall. This is just over 1 foot, 1 foot 3 inches, very small, but it was mostly human-looking. Now, in a televised interview, Omar gave a detailed description of this figure. As Omar says, its hair was combed flat in the middle, and the back was raised, almost meeting in the middle of the head. His hair was copper-colored, and he had dark, bulging eyes, no eyelashes, no eyebrows, and he had a pointed nose that ended straight down the bottom. His upper lip was thin, not very thick, thin but big, and his lower bottom lip was thin too, but it was a big mouth. His face was a little round, but the little thing stood out. His clothes were like a sweatshirt with a kind of t-shirt, like those dark brown lumberjack shirts, and it faded until it became a light brown in the middle. Everything was like that. The top and the bottom were pants. They were halfway up his leg, a little longer perhaps, and he had something rigid at the waist. The waist was rigid, also the same color, and in the same way crooked. I mean, his feet were crooked. I couldn't see his feet, but his hands were long, his fingers long, and he didn't have nails. So yeah, he was wearing a belt of some kind, weird clothes, weird hair, an unusual face. Everything about him was unusual, and so short. So Omar and Walter immediately tried to approach this figure, but when they did, something really amazing happened. Some weird sort of magnetic force field or something prevented them from approaching. They assumed it was some sort of magnetic force field. After a short time of trying to approach this creature, it quickly ran off. Omar and Walter reported their sighting to the police, and news spread fast. This led to them being interviewed by a news team, and it was soon learned that a lady who tended her flock of sheep nearby in the Valles Chalchaqui also saw this, apparently the same strange little being. She gave the same exact description. And then came further confirmation because newsmen interviewed a resident in the area who said, and I quote, "It's true. Everyone here says they see lights in the sky. There are people here who are afraid and don't want to go out at night." Another said, "The kids are not going out at night for fear of strange beings and UFOs." So yeah, a lot of sightings were going on at this time. And in fact, researcher Luis Burgos confirmed this, that the area had a recent, quote, avalanche of sightings, which he says are, quote, accompanied by all kinds of events, such as sightings of amphibians, objects falling from the sky, sightings of ships, and mysterious explosions. So this created quite a furor in this small town. Deputy Commissioner Luis Colmenares told the news that the descriptions provided by the witnesses are very consistent, but that the humanoid has, quote, not been seen again. If he were to return, it would be good to confirm that this was the case. As you can see, that case put the whole town in an uproar and had a huge effect on everybody involved. It's a very unusual case. There aren't a lot of cases involving humanoids that are less than 3 feet tall, but it does turn up. There was a study, I think, quoted by researcher George Fawcett, who said that 60% of humanoid reports involve beings that are 4 feet tall or less. So that does seem to comprise the majority of cases, though as we've seen in this compilation here, some can be quite tall, upwards of 8 feet. So here again we see a very wide variation of humanoids, but pretty much all humanoids. Bipedal, 2 arms, 2 legs, eyes, nose, mouth, and so forth, which has huge implications and raises all kinds of questions. So there you go, that's our episode for today. Really interesting cases coming from all over the world over quite a long period of time, most involving multiple witnesses, a wide variety of evidence to support it. I think this subject is so important. Everybody deserves to know the truth about it. It's why I do this research. That, and it's endlessly fascinating. So many cases. So thank you very much, you guys, for watching. I truly appreciate it. It's because of you I do these shows. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And until next week, keep searching for the truth, because it's up to you to find it, to ask those hard questions, and most of all, keep having fun, because that's also very important. I will see you next Friday. Bye for now.